I am presenting Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, November 7th, 2021. The lesson is entitled Moses' Prayer and God's Answer. Lesson text comes from Numbers chapter 14, verses 13 through 24. Related scriptures are Nehemiah 9, 16 through 21, Psalms 102, 1 through 28, 145, 8 through 13, John 12, 37 through 40. The place is Kadesh. The time is about 1443 BC. As we continue our study in the book of Numbers, we move from the people's rebellion in Numbers 14, 1 through 12, to Moses' prayer and God's answer in verses 13 through 24. In our lesson text today, we will peer through a very unique window into a prayerful conversation between Moses, the man of God, and the Lord himself. In this dialogue, we will encounter a man pleading for rebellious people to a God whom seems altogether fed up with those people. In this narrative, we will also see the power of prayer on display as Moses pleads for guilty people and the Lord turns aside from a just posture that called for their complete destruction. It is truly a shame that Israel had gotten to this point. Their spiritual condition was not good. Their doubt and faithlessness and rebellion had been displayed over and over again. They simply were not taking God seriously. Today's aim, facts, to illustrate that God hears and responds to the sincere prayers of his faithful servants. Principle, to reaffirm the power of prayer in changing circumstances, regardless of how dire the situations may seem to be. Application, to establish a consistent prayer life that demonstrates complete trust in and dependency on the Lord. Illustrating the lesson. Moses' prayer for his people diverted the immediate and devastating judgment of God on them and brought pardon. While Moses' situation was unique, his actions demonstrate the amazing power of prayer that faithful believers possess. Practical points. 1. Because we declare ourselves Christians, our reputation is tied to God's. We must be careful not to defame his name. Numbers 14, 13 through 14. 2. God's enemies are always looking for ways to discredit him, but we must defend his character. Verses 15 through 16. 3. We can always appeal to God's attributes in our times of need because he is unchanging. Verses 16 through 18. 4. God's pardon of our sins is based on his mercy alone, so we can never appeal to him on the basis of works. Verse 19. 5. Even though God forgives our sin, he may still chastise us for it. We must not test the Lord. Verses 20 through 23. 6. When we take a stand for God, he will reward us. Verse 24. Golden text. The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Numbers 14, 18. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is Moses' great request, Numbers 14, 13 through 19. And the second is God's great judgment, Numbers 14, 20 through 24. Introduction. Interceding for people who continually try to bring them harm to you is a very difficult thing to do. However, it is one of the things that makes us as Christians different from the rest of the world. We are to forgive, love, serve, and pray for our enemies. Matthew 5, 43 through 48, Luke 6, 27 through 28, Romans 12, 20. Moses was a man who walked with the Lord and learned to trust him completely. He had loved the children of Israel since his days as a prince in Pharaoh's palace when he killed an Egyptian who was abusing an Israelite slave. Exodus 2, 11 through 12. As Moses led the Israelites, there were times when he grew frustrated with them and wondered why God chose him at all. But he never wavered in his love for the people. Loving people who do not love us in return is not easy, but God will bless us for doing so. Moses' great request, Numbers 14:13. And Moses said unto the Lord, then the Egyptians shall hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them. Verse 14. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land, for they have heard that thou, Lord, art among this people, that thou, Lord, art seen face to face, and that thy cloud standeth over them, and that thou goest before them by daytime in a pillar of a cloud, and in a pillar of fire by night. Verse 15. And if thou shalt kill all this people as one man, then the nations which have heard the fame of thee will speak, saying, verse 16, because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he sware unto them, therefore he hath slain them in the wilderness. Verse 17, and now I beseech thee, let the power of my Lord be great, according as thou hast spoken, saying, verse 18, the Lord is longsuffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Verse 19, pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people according unto thy greatness of thy mercy, and as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. What will the Egyptians say? Numbers 14:13 through 14. Because they were afraid, the children of Israel rebelled against entering the promised land and decided to replace Moses with another leader, one who would take them back to Egypt. Verse 4. Witnessing this was no doubt a very painful and stressful experience for Moses. Yet when God tested him by offering to destroy the people and make a new and stronger nation out of Moses, the great leader pleaded on behalf of the very people who were rejecting his leadership. Moses began his intercession for the Israelites by reminding God that if he destroyed these people he had previously delivered, news of it would eventually reach Egypt. The Egyptians in turn would tell the inhabitants of Canaan. These pagan people would not only gloat over Israel's destruction, but would also have reason to impugn the character and power of the God of Israel. They would not fear him. When the Israelites were still slaves in Egypt, Pharaoh had shown no respect for the Lord. Because of Pharaoh's hard heart, God unleashed the 10 plagues on Egypt, which eventually brought about Israel's deliverance from slavery. If God brought the Israelites out of Egypt only to kill them in the wilderness, his deliverance would be incomplete. The Egyptians might still see Israel's God as powerful, but not as an omnipotent or trustworthy. There was no mistaking God's presence with Israel after they left Egypt. He had led them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God did not hide himself from Israel or their enemies. His presence was very visible. If the Lord now destroyed the Israelites, Moses reasoned, then the other nations would not only gloat over Israel's annihilation, but also deem God to be incapable of giving them victory. His majestic presence with Israel would have been meaningless. What would the world say? Numbers 14:15 through 16. Moses certainly did not deny that God was able to destroy the Israelites as he was threatening. In fact, Moses knew God was able to wipe Israel out in one fell swoop if he so chose, which is why he pleaded so earnestly for them. The false conclusion that unbelieving nations would draw from God's destruction of the people is what concerned Moses. If God were to destroy the Israelites because of their unbelief, then the report of the 10 spies would be echoed throughout Canaan. The various peoples would rejoice and say that the Lord was unable to bring Israel into Canaan and inhabit the land. Even as the spies had said, he may have brought them out of Egypt, but he was not able to bring them into Canaan. The very thing that angered God about the spies' report would be broadcast throughout the entire land. Moses did not doubt God's power, and he did not want anyone else to do it either. He wanted other nations to know that there is only one God, not only over Israel, but also over the entire world. Moses feared that if God destroyed the nation, he had created, it would leave a permanent blemish on his reputation among the very people he had planned to defeat on behalf of his people. It is important to note that Moses never said the children of Israel were undeserving of punishment. He did not disagree with God that they were rebellious and insolent. The Israelites were guilty of everything God had charged them with, and Moses knew it. So he never tried to use Israel's goodness, innocence, or ignorance as reasons why God should not punish them. Instead, the basis for Moses' plea for Israel was the Lord's promise to give them the land, a promise that would not be kept if he destroyed the nation of Israel. What the Lord himself has said, Numbers 14, 17 through 18. Moses did not want the greatness of God's power questioned. Instead, he wanted it put on display for all to see. He understood that the only way for the Lord to display such greatness and maintain his integrity was through forgiving Israel's sins. Some might expect God to annihilate those who sinned against him. This was certainly how ancient people expected their gods to behave. What would be entirely unexpected, however, was for God to forgive them. Forgiveness always stands out from wrath. Outbursts of anger are often displayed by people who have been wronged by someone else. It is hardly newsworthy when an offended party displays anger toward those who have offended him. What is shocking, however, is when an injured person reaches out in reconciliation instead of retaliation. It is not natural but entirely divine to forgive someone. It goes against our nature to do so. Yet that is exactly what Moses was calling on God to do for Israel. Moses was appealing to his loving nature that he himself had proclaimed, verse 17. God is not bound by human emotions. He does not act like a petulant child. He still loves sinners in spite of their sin. God is not subject to irrational outbursts of anger as humans are. He does not have a short fuse as some are prone to have. God does not get angry easily, and it is certainly not the first thing he demonstrates to us when we sin. If it were, none of us would even exist right now. God had described himself as long-suffering or slow to anger, verse 18. He is very patient with us, merciful and forgiving. The Lord's self-destruction is proof that God certainly was merciful and loving in Old Testament times. These truths are not merely New Testament inventions. Some people have tried to portray God as being only wrathful and angry in the Old Testament, which is a gross misrepresentation. God is and always has been gracious. However, that does not mean that he winks at sin and pretends it does not exist. What grace means is that Christ, our substitute, bore the punishment for our sin, and this propitiated or satisfied God's wrath against us and brings us salvation. Romans 3, 24 through 25. Those who do not turn to the Lord in faith and receive his forgiveness and salvation, however, remain under God's wrath. John 3, 36. Sometimes sin becomes so entrenched in us that it becomes a family thing. Children learn certain behaviors from their parents, who learn them from their parents, and so on and on. Thus, the punishment for sin keeps going on down the family line. God does not punish a child for what the parent does, but many times children grow up and perpetuate the sins of their parents and grandparents. Those who repent, however, are forgiven of their sins. What Moses prayed. Numbers 14, 19. Moses was close enough with God that he could make what on its face seems like an audacious request. He asked the Lord to pardon the people for their sin. Moses was not merely asking God to overlook Israel's sin or simply trying to help them escape punishment. He was asking God to wipe the stain from their record. They would not be destroyed, but would continue to be his people under his care. When a person is pardoned for a crime, that person's record is wiped clean. All records of the offense are eliminated, and the person can never face the punishment that is demanded by that crime. That is precisely what Moses was asking for on behalf of the Israelites. The basis for this plea, again, was the greatness of God's mercy, not the people's supposed goodness. Moses also turned to past precedent set by God, as he had already forgiven the Israelites a number of times for offenses they had committed in their journey toward Canaan. Instead of throwing up his hands in aspiration over the Israelites, Moses continued to intercede for them according to the mercy the Lord had already shown. God's great judgment. Verse 20. And the Lord said, I have pardoned according to thy word. Verse 21. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Verse 22. Because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice. Verse 23. Surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither see any of them that provoked me see it. Verse 24. But my servant Caleb, because he have another spirit with him, and have followed me fully, him will I bring into the land whereunto he went, and his seed shall possess it. Pardon for Israel. Numbers 14:20. God responded to Moses by granting his request. He affirmed that he had pardoned Israel just as Moses had asked him to do. He would not destroy Israel as he had previously said, but he would continue to lead, guide, and report them and protect them through the wilderness into the land he had promised to them long before, going back to Abraham. Genesis 12:1 through 3, 13:14 through 17, 15:13 through 16. Punishment for the rebels. Numbers 14:21 through 23. The fact that God had answered Moses' prayer did not mean there would be no consequences whatsoever for Israel's rebellion. We should never presume that God's grace means that we are not disciplined for the sins we commit. God would not be loving if he allowed us to continue in sin completely undeterred. If he did, we would not be people who loved him. We would end up as spoiled brats who never learn to love and serve one another other than ourselves. The Lord disciplines those who love him. Hebrews 12:6. God announced to Moses that his glory would still be displayed throughout the earth. This would come both through his forgiveness and through the judgment he would bring. He would pardon the iniquity of the people, but his name would still be revered by all. Although God would not extinguish the entire nation, he would hold the rebels accountable for their unbelief. Those who had witnessed God's mighty hand of deliverance only to test him over and over again would not see the promised land at all. Those who despised the Lord instead of trusting and obeying him would never see it. Verse 29 elaborates on this judgment, explaining that all those 20 years old and above would die in the wilderness without entering the land. It was the end of the line for a generation that refused to take God at his word and trust him in the midst of their trials. And an exemption from the penalty, Numbers 14:24. When the 10 spies were given their negative report and discouraging the Israelites from any hope of taking possession of the land, Caleb went against popular opinion and the majority report. Although the people did not want to hear it, he spoke in accordance with God's promise and declared that they were able to take the land in spite of the presence of the giants that were there. 13:30, 14:6 through 9. Even though the people refused to hear Caleb's voice, the Lord heard him loud and clear. God always hears the voice of faith. The voice of faith rings loudly above the voice of unbelief in the ears of God, and he always honors faith. Since Caleb was willing to speak up for God, God spoke up for him and exempted him from the punishment due that generation of Israelites. Joshua would not suffer that judgment either, because he had stood with Caleb against the tide of unbelief and negativity. Verse 30. These two men were not spared from punishment because they were sinless, but because they were faithful. God identified Caleb as his servant and said that he possessed a different spirit than the other spies did. This shows that Caleb had a close walk with God, as the title "my servant" had been applied only to Moses up to this point in Numbers 12:7 through 8. A true servant of God is one who follows him no matter where he leads and is known by his faith and love for God. This is an apt description of Caleb, who never wavered in his faith. At a time when the people were contemplating killing Caleb, 13:10, the Lord recognized his faith and courage and commended him to Moses. When you stand firm in your faith in the midst of trying times, you can be almost certain the world is not going to give you a prize or reward you for your faith and determination. In fact, the world is likely to despise, ridicule, and even threaten you over your stands. God, however, rewards those who stand firm in their faith. Luke 6:22 through 23, James 1:12, 1 Peter 1:6 through 7. Those who turn away from him in unbelief will find themselves on the outside looking in on a land of blessings. Questions. 1. How did Moses respond to God's offer to destroy the Israelites and start a new nation with him? 2. What did Moses argue that the pagan peoples would conclude if God destroyed Israel? 3. How would destroying the nation contradict God's own promise? 4. How did Moses want God to display his great power? 5. To what did Moses appeal in the Lord's description of himself? 6. On what basis did Moses appeal to God to pardon the people? 7. What does being pardoned for sin not mean? 8. What judgment did the Lord pronounce on the rebels? 9. How had Caleb demonstrated his faithfulness to the Lord? 10. What two people were exempted from God's judgment? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, November 7th, 2021. Thank you for listening. God bless.